Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Helena Bennett. I'm going to moderate this panel today. I'm a climate and human rights activist based in London in the UK. And today we're going to be having a conversation about one of the most important but also challenging activities of our time at the moment, and that is on being an activist, activist well-being, and burnout as well. So 2019 was a really big year in terms of climate activism. We saw the largest climate demonstrations in history with over 7.5 million people on the streets, mostly led by youth. But as I'm sure you're all acutely aware, the landscape has been completely different this year. COVID-19 has forced us all to stay at home to protect ourselves, our families and friends, and everybody who is most at risk from COVID-19. The challenge of how to be an activist without the power of public demonstration and being able to be on the streets has been really significant in terms of what we've been able to do. But it hasn't stopped messages being spread to governments and leaders all around the world that we need really urgent and ambitious climate policy and action. And all of this has been done remotely, digitally, virtually, through the power of technology and community action. So on the panel today, we've got a really amazing group of people who are going to chat a bit more about the different challenges of being an activist and burnout and eco-anxiety. So we have Lynn, who is the founder of Climate Strike Thailand. And Lynn, just a shout out to you because it's, I think, 1 a.m. where you are. So thanks so much for being here. We have Days, who is a UK-based climate justice activist. We have Paul, who's a social justice activist, author, editor, and the founder of the Equity Literary Institute and EdChange. And we also have Bonnie Wright, who's an actor, director, and environmentalist. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm just going to start with a first icebreaker question. If you could describe being an activist in 2020 in one word, what would that word be? Lynn, let's start with you.
Hi. Hectic, I guess. A lot of words for being, I don't know, I guess I've just never been an activist in any other era, so I don't really have anything to compare it against, but to compare it against other aspects of life, it's definitely very stressful.
Yeah, stressful is a good one, yeah. Days, how about you?
I would probably go for the word malleability, because at this moment we've really had to change the way that we do things, especially with my activism, which is mostly using my body, and then realizing that can't be done now. So it had to be really malleable and finding different ways to challenge power.
Yeah, I love that. Bonnie?
I would say this year has been a lot of patience, I think, with all parts of life. I think, that I just have to keep checking in with knowing that this is like a long journey and being patient with it, I would say.
Yeah, I really like that. And Paul?
I feel like it's a little crowded. I feel like everyone at home on social media, especially in the US with this stuff going on here around police violence and racism, are imagining themselves suddenly as activists. So it's feeling a bit crowded.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think that for me anyway, the more I've learned about things like the climate crisis, the more I've realized there are so many other different issues that we need to start thinking about and how they all intersect. And yeah, I really like that word. So I was involved with XR a couple of years ago, almost since it started. And my experience of that was there wasn't really much discussion around eco-anxiety and burnout and activist well-being right at the start. So I'm really interested to hear from you guys about what you think around, is there enough dialogue on issues of mental health and burnout within the climate activism movement at the moment? Paul, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think there's a growing amount of dialogue about it. I think mental health challenges in particular need to be named a little bit more explicitly. I think there's a lot of dialogue about it and people writing blogs and that sort of thing. I think the problem is most of that dialogue is happening outside of movements and outside of movement organizations. So it's not seen as part of activism, but it's seen as something people have to remove themselves from activism to talk about and attend to. So a lot of dialogue, but not enough action within movements.
Yeah. And Days, I know you've been involved in Extinction Rebellion in the UK. Have you found that that's kind of changed, that dialogue about well-being and mental health?
Yeah, I slightly disagree with you, because 1/4 of XR is regenerative cultures, which is well-being, which is saying how can we learn how to build behaviors to take care of ourselves, take care of the people around us, and take care of our planet. So regenerative cultures and well-being is a really, really core part of what we do, whether that's action well-being, which is a thing that I feel like most people will be more accustomed to, like if you're super glued onto a road, there is someone who's there with a spoon feeding you soups and reading you books for hours, or more to the actually having listening circles to really discuss about grief. And a lot of the work that I did in Extinction Rebellion Youth was around that, having that conversation and talking and creating community. And I think that's a really large part. But I think what we need to do is start bringing this more outwards. So it's not just us in our activist communities talking about well-being or how we can create community, but realizing that we're all in this together and that we need to start reaching out to other communities who aren't engaged in activism and making sure that well-being is at the core of that.
Yeah, I love that. Lynn, do you have any thoughts on this, about perhaps how maybe it's a little bit different in Thailand than in the UK?
It's very different here. Actually, just as my individual, like the movement here is not as big, and also with Climate Strike Thailand that I do, it comes off. We do occasional strikes, so it's not like I gather with a group of people and all. And when I do talk about the environment, it's mainly with other people who live sustainably and all. And when we do discuss things about climate anxiety, it's a bit sad, because the more we discuss it, the more we get anxious over it, because we're like, oh no, you feel the same way about the world coming to an end. I do too. Oh no, is the world really going to come to an end? So sometimes I'd rather just not talk about it because it gets too stressful. But yeah, very different over here. Less people in the community, so less discussion.
Yeah. And Bonnie, do you have much experience of kind of activist burnout? And if so, how do you handle it and deal with it and recover?
Yeah, I think it's important to first mention that I feel it's always to be hyper aware of being in a position of privilege, to have maybe tools and resources around mental health, whether that's someone to talk to, whether that's friends that I don't feel stigmatized by bringing up these kind of subjects with. I think it's important to first mention that I do respect my resources that I have, how I can manage my time as well if I need to pull back and I'm feeling burnt out, and how I can maybe refocus and work on other things I'm doing. So I think I'm always very aware of that, and how do we change that? How do we change that really skewed and unfair access to resources and tools, so that people can have someone or somewhere to go to talk to people when they are anxious and overwhelmed by this subject.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Yeah. I'm interested to know if any of you have ever had to take a break from activism or the work you're doing, or been close to kind of breakdown, I guess, just because of how intense everything is. Have any of you experienced that before? Yeah, go ahead, Days.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you're constantly thinking about crisis and extinction. It's quite big for anyone. So yeah, I've had moments, but I think especially like with the way that regenerative cultures work, it's being mindful about yourself and your own capacity as a person. And, I take regen breaks all the time. And it's kind of weird as well, because I work outside of activist circles. And when you go, okay, guys, I'm feeling really burnt out now, so I'm going to take 2 weeks off for regen, people are like, what? Excuse me, you've got emails to answer. So I think it is that kind of needing to push for society to really understand. And I think COVID was a really, really big push for that, because I feel like people, especially at the beginning, they realized how tired they really were from the lives that they were leading, and they found more of a relaxation of finding time to spend with your family, with your friends, whether that's over Zoom or in person, or going out into nature way more. And that could be something that we can really take on post-COVID time.
Yeah, I love that. Paul, based on your research, do you have any kind of ideas about what the lead causes of burnout is for activists?
Yeah, well, I did this research over a few years, and my friends and I who were doing this with me, we interviewed about 100 activists. This is all in the US, but 100 activists who had experienced burnout. And I think the lead causes, one is just the amount of pressure activists were putting on themselves. People who are activists tend to have a big scope understanding of the suffering that's happening and the damage that's being done in ways that most people don't understand or don't even want to understand, and sort of the pressure of that and feeling like if I take 5 minutes of a break, then I'm kind of selling out. When actually the truth is, if I don't take 5 minutes of a break, I'm not in the long run going to be able to sustain my activism. So that is a big thing that came out. Another big thing is how people are treated by individuals and organizations that aren't happy with the activism that they're doing. So threat of police intervention, surveillance, and that sort of thing. Probably the most troubling thing that we found is that most of the activists identified their biggest source of burnout as how they're treated by other activists. And the two big things, again, this is in U.S. organizations and movements. We probably interviewed about 60 women, and I would say 2/3 of those women had experienced sexual harassment, something between sexual harassment and sexual assault from other activists. We interviewed probably about 30 activists of color. Every single one of them had experienced racism within the context of their movement. So those are things, and that gets to that kind of intersectional stuff you were mentioning earlier. Those seem to be the biggest causes that we've been able to identify.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear if any of you have any ideas about how that kind of culture can be overcome. I'm aware we've got 3 other female panelists on here, so I don't know if any of you have any kind of experience or advice about how to overcome perhaps issues like that might arise in activist circles.
I think it's flagging it out. I feel like, especially within activism, I don't know how much I can swear, but we don't take shit, and it's like, this is the whole point of it. So we shouldn't accept that in our movement, and addressing things with kindness and empathy and just going, hi, Sam, I didn't like what you did today. This is, a microaggression, and this is how it made me feel. And being open to have that dialogue within spaces, because when we start to respect each other's boundaries is when we can actually start to understand how to respect the Earth's boundaries as well, and it's all interconnected. And especially, I think for me, at least personally, I think it's not the active, like the anxiety within my movement around well-being, but it's actually externally. Like, I have a lot of social media hate that happens a lot of the time. A majority of the time it's not even about the climate, it's mostly about my age or my race or my gender, and having to figure out how to source through that and how to process those feelings that do come up when I feel attacked or I feel insecure. That's something that I think all of us need to learn how to do for now, and then we need to ask better from people around us in our society.
Yes, yeah, it's a great answer. So, Lynn, I'm really interested to know what you think the key challenges are that you've faced in terms of mobilizing people in Thailand and Southeast Asia.
It's a big lack of education, a big lack of awareness. So, you don't fight for a cause if you don't know what you're fighting for. And because of that, I think a lot of movements in Thailand or in Southeast Asia are still lacking in number. Because we have very little environmental education here. It's just poor environmental education. For example, here we're still struggling with plastic. But what really gets Thai people is, or at least right now, is just the more human, emotional stuff. Right now we're having these democratic protests going on very currently. What I'm trying to do with people I work with right now is how to tie that, that democratic movement in with the environmental movements. And there's still that big gap, of understanding of how environmental issues and social issues are interconnected. So we're really trying to put that kind of human face on there. And hopefully that gets more people to join in, to really demand the right to clean air, to clean water, knowing that these are as much social issues as they are environmental.
Yeah. And it feels like for someone like you that's kind of leading this this movement in Thailand and in Southeast Asia, that's just a lot of pressure for a young person. So, I mean, do we feel like there's too much being asked or demanded of this kind of young generation at the moment of climate activists in terms of trying to lead the charge? You think of other young activists around the world who have taken to the global stage recently, and people their household names. Bonnie, what do you think? Do you think there's kind of too much being demanded of this younger generation?
It's hard. I think it's really interesting and exciting that the youth are able to redefine their identity. I think for so long we were told that young people didn't care and they weren't politically engaged and they were kind of lazy, and I think that is so untrue, and I'm excited that narrative is being rewritten, because I think it shows that there's just so much power in the youth. And I think using social media to such high advantage, and for really calling people out, and for exposing and being a kind of generation of people that just really seek transparency. And I think often, honestly, when I feel low and burnt out about situations, I just usually kind of connect or speak to younger activists that I have the honor to know, and they really just give me so much hope in amongst this conversation that's constantly about the end of something. So I'm always so amazed, but I do, yes, think that there's a huge pressure to be always on. I think that's the thing. I think just being engaged on our phones and having to always form opinions, I think is quite a difficult thing to ask of people, to sort of always decide where we're standing, or how we think about someone's tweet or someone's post. I think I am concerned that kind of puts you in your nervous system at quite like a high sort of like fight or flight mode. So I don't know, I'm always torn. I'm like so pumped and hopeful, and then I'm also sometimes like silently worried, but I think that stems through all generations. So yeah, I think to answer the question, I think at times it can be a lot, but it's kind of what else? If this is your future, what else do you do but fight for it?
I think there's definitely that clash, with young people, just observing what's happening in Thailand right now, and just from myself, it's like, I guess young people have this kind of fire and passion of like, we want to see a beautiful world, and then we're going to create that world, but then we've got this this huge fire that burns out so quickly, and then it falls back into this vicious cycle of like, yes, I'm gonna save the planet. And then you start saving the planet, and then you realize like, oh, whoa, it wasn't that easy. And then you break down, and then you're about to give up, and then you're like, oh wait, I can't just sit still. I have to save the planet, and I can. And then suddenly you start saving the planet again, and then you're like, this is too hard. I'm gonna watch a movie. And it just keeps going on and on. Yeah, just like listening to what Paul was saying earlier about the research. It was like hearing someone talk about your astrology sign and being like, okay, that ticks. Just about this whole pressure from. I remember at one point, I guess around this time last year, it just felt like, okay, if I don't do more today. Every single day is a countdown towards. I think I had in mind exactly 2050. The world's going to blow up, and I've got these many years to do something about it, and every day counts. And so, going to sleep every night and waking up each morning was just very stressful because you just feel like there's no way you can't do enough, and you can't sleep well. You wake up and you're just anxious, and it's not good.
Yeah, I think all of us here, and I imagine a lot of people watching and a lot of other activists, can completely identify with what you've just said about that cycle of don't want to work too hard, but I also feel like I need to do something about what's going on. Paul, I'm interested to know if you've got any advice for activists who are feeling overwhelmed or frustrated in terms of, how they can deal with the kind of problems of eco-anxiety and everything else going on before burnout happens, to kind of avoid that crash.
I think the most important thing is just having open conversations about it, and I think in a lot of movements, I think also moving from a focus on self-care to a focus on community care. So I'm not just thinking about how do I take care of myself as an activist, but I also reflect on how do my beliefs and actions affect the other activists around me and maybe contribute to their burnout. I think moving from that purely self-care to a community care model, and then just having conversations about it. And I would really encourage also organizational leaders and movement leaders who often seem to be people who can work 80 hours a week and then end up having ridiculous expectations for the people in their organizations. I think we can all do stuff for ourselves and sort of let go of this pressure that we have to do everything. But I also think it's really important to think about what we can do for one another to sustain one another as activists.
Yeah, and I feel like what you're saying there about community care really fits in well with what Days was talking about around, regenerative culture and that kind of, looking after each other within the movement. So Days, do you have any kind of quick, words of advice for people that might not be familiar with how to start building that into their community and their movement?
Yeah, so I think the best bit about regenerative cultures is that it's really fitted and suited to your community. So it's something that you guys create together, and it's this like collaborative effort. For Extinction Rebellion, we see it as like 5 different like parts, pillars in a way. So the first one is self-care. It's how can you take care of the body, the mind, the soul, but also the really deep self-care of asking yourself what part of society do you play? What is the privilege that you hold? How can you dismantle this? And really kind of purging yourself of the toxic systems and toxic socialization that we've become accustomed to, and re-socializing yourself to be better. And then next, how you relate with other individuals, and something on the lines of what Paul said about how your actions affect others, and that really like self-awareness that we should all be aiming for. And then how we can take our healthy selves and our healthy relationships into our community, how we can start building things together. How can we start saying, who needs that extra hand? How can I dismantle my privilege to bring other people up? How can I take a step back to bring other people forward? And then how we can take this into action care, like I briefly spoke about, whether it's, the taking care of someone in an action, whether it's the debriefs, post actions. We're talking about how we felt, not in like a really like, oh, was it a good action? Was it a bad action? But was it like, what was the feelings it brought up in us? How did we connect to this action? And then finally, we taking that to the earth and saying, we need to learn better. And I think especially I normally use the example of colonization, because colonization, we learn how to abuse people, we learn how to use people, see them as resources, and we've done the same to the earth. And once we start correcting this behavior change, that's how we're going to get sustainability, and not only sustainability but regeneration in all social parts. And this is where the climate almost sits as a byproduct of the society collapsing and social justice issues.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that the idea of colonialism up, actually, because with the Black Lives Matter protests earlier in the year, I feel like from what I've seen anyway, especially on social media, there's been a big rise in the amount of conversations happening around the intersection of racial justice and environmental and climate justice. And while we can't predict what's going to happen with COVID and lockdowns and everything, I'm keen to hear your guys' thoughts on how that kind of intersectionality of different justice issues, especially regarding climate change, is going to change over the next year or so. Bonnie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think mean, I think it's changing already. I think just bringing up that topic that intersects so clearly. I think from my experience here, I'm based in LA in California, and I mean the amount of drilling and kind of facilities, very polluting facilities that exist in California is like very, very high by comparison to any other state in the US, and how disproportionately people are affected by that, because most of these facilities are based around communities of lower income and people of color. And it's just from my experience of meeting a lot of those communities who have now become activists in this space, it's just clear and on your doorstep how the two issues intersect. And I think it's interesting that slowly, or not interesting, I think it's sad that slowly those realities will come closer and closer to our doorsteps. I think just how disproportionately affected people will become. I think especially as well how, the idea of climate then creating more refugees within this country, within this world. And I think just more and more it will just be on our doorstep, and it won't be these things that I have struggled sometimes when you're communicating a story such as marine and ocean plastics. It's very, very far away, and sometimes if you don't have that person or person in your neighborhood that has experienced something directly, you kind of find it harder to connect to that issue. And I think now more and more we will begin to know people who have been affected by a climate related issue, which is I think what this year is so highlighted for us with COVID is this interconnectedness of things, and I was realizing we're really not that far away from the issue. So I think with this intersection of social environmental justice, I think it's just going to become clearer and clearer. And I think again with this like lifting the veil constantly, that I think this time is about this kind of really the transparency that we're wishing to see behind things. I just don't think. And I think, obviously cancel culture is the extreme of that, but I think people will just be called out more continually. And I don't think people can hide from the issues as much. So I don't know if that answers the question. But,
yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts on kind of that intersection of different issues over the next few years? Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I actually came to climate change through air pollution because it affected me and my community. And I think once we start actually understanding how this relates, like I remember when I lived in Lincolnshire, for 6 years we experienced flooding every year, but we were just told that was just flooding and it just kind of happens every year. And when I found out, no, this is not just happening, this is climate change, and moving to London and having asthma and realizing, oh no, it's not just because London's air is polluted, it's because there's so much traffic, there's motorways in amidst communities, there's incinerators in amidst communities. And that was especially with where I'm originally from in North London. There's a massive incinerator that's almost like a mile, 2 miles away from a hospital, and they're wondering how it's affecting communities. And is this kind of just, as you said before, just saying like it's just not good enough, and it's always affecting the people who are the most marginalized in communities. And once we start speaking up and saying this is unacceptable anymore and we aren't taking it, I feel like things will change.
Can I just jump in here too? Just share a thought about that too. I think this is an excellent conversation. I love this. I think this needs to start by dealing with the racism that exists within the climate movement and within environmental movements. And to remember, I don't know the story in other parts of the world, but in the US, the environmental justice movement was started by Black families because of the toxic sites that were being sited near their homes. The environmental movement and sustainability and climate movement themselves have been colonized by kind of liberalish white people, many of whom, well, if you bring up race, will just say, well, if we're talking, we're not focusing on the environment if we talk about race, and they want to separate the issues. And so, the fact that, again, at least in the US, the public face of these movements is white, but a majority of the people doing the most important activist work on the ground in communities are people of color, people of the global majority. So I think this has to start with dealing not just racism, but also dealing with sexism and other forms of oppression that exist within environmental movements. And if we refuse to do that, I mean, we're all just hypocrites in the end, because all these justice issues are interconnected.
Yeah, so true. And yeah, I'm really glad you raised that point, Paul, about where the kind of environmental justice movement started. I think it's so important to acknowledge where the movement came from and how it's been built upon, and kind of give, thanks and gratefulness to the people that started that and have kind of built upon that as the years have gone on. It's so important to recognise where that movement began. So we're coming up to kind of towards the end of the panel. I'm really interested in hearing a few last thoughts from you guys, a little bit more personal, kind of specifically around any practices or resources that you have that you find most useful or most comforting, or that you would suggest to other people in terms of coping and managing your own well-being, what you do to avoid burnout, or what you would suggest to a friend or a colleague to avoid burnout, that you have found particularly useful for yourself or your community. Lynn, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've had a lot of coping mechanisms for just climate activism. I think my biggest breakdown was around the same time last year, this year. But it just got to one point where every day I was just sacrificing my own mental well-being with climate activism, and I'd wake up at 2-3 in the morning and just cry. It's like I'm gonna die. And just wanting it to stop. And at one point my friend just asked me, like, what are you doing this for? Or does this make you happy? And I think that really made me question why I'm doing all of this. And then I just worked through it, and what I've come up with this mental mindset model that has really worked well for me is just kind of in a way giving up all hope and accepting that, okay, we're kind of doomed, but then at the same time, because I guess accepting that, okay, we're all gonna die, and that brings me such relief, because I'm like, okay, well, I'm not pressured to succeed in saving the planet and living eternally. And I'm just gonna do my best, regardless of whether polluting corporates or governments listen to our demands, regardless of whether this whole activism works at all. I'm just going to do my best and have this wonderful vision of the world and just move forward to there. And yeah, I think that sort of acceptance of not ever succeeding gives me some kind of relief, because I'm just not pressured every day that, like, this is virtually impossible, that we're going to reverse climate change, and so I've just got that 1%, to strive for, and it's so difficult. So instead, I'm just saying, well, it's not gonna work. But what's there's nothing to lose to try.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like I know what you mean. You kind of under promise and under expect in a way. So that any kind of success feels like a huge win. Days, how about you?
Yeah, I think, I've had moments, especially over the last couple of weeks. I was doing some research for this thing I'm doing, and I saw a photo of the home that I lived in Lincolnshire being flooded, and flooding to the point of it actually being above, much higher than me, which really saddened me. And I did have a moment of that deep sorrow of grieving and understanding that, predictions are showing that in 2030, large parts of Lincolnshire will cease to exist anymore. And this will cause, people having to leave their homes and leaving what they love. And, it is really sad. But then I have there's this phrase that one of my elders in activism taught me, and it's the idea of love and rage, and how every single day there is at least something that makes us smile or giggle and laugh. And the fact that the world is so shit now, especially after COVID, and we can still find such joy and love within our communities, within our families, within ourselves. That is what we're aiming for. And imagine right now seeing it survival, and then the next step is flourishing. And that's what we're aiming for with our activism. We're aiming to flourish. We're aiming to live lives that mean and feel true to us. And then that rage is the space of having space to grieve the loss that you're feeling, and like holding yourself in that and asking people to hold you within that as well, and finding a community which can hold you within the grief that you're feeling, and using that rage and that anger, and as Lynn had mentioned before, that youthful passion to really fight for what you believe in. And I think just having that, you know, whenever I sign off emails, I always go love and rage, because I want everyone to remember the beauty of life and the fire that burns inside you to create social change.
Yeah, that's a really lovely answer, actually. And I guess remembering those kind of moments of happiness also reminds you of why you're doing what you're doing, to kind of save that joy and that happiness. Yeah.
Even I got a poster in Rebellion that said, this is the only way you can dance yourself out of extinction. And that's like one of my favorite phrases now. So I always tell everyone, I'm like, the protest, you're dancing yourself out of extinction.
Love that. That's my next mantra going forward. Bonnie, any last thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, you know, activism and all of these spaces are very kind of, I mean, maybe not so much this year as we're not so much on the streets or doing public events, but it can be quite a sort of, you know, it's quite an outward sort of way to relate and connect with people in the issue. And I personally am quite an introverted person, so find sometimes those spaces and constantly putting out there can be quite overwhelming. So I find when I do get to that kind of overwhelming burnout of being around a big issue or a lot of people, I find it's just these small kind of practices within the kind of four walls of my home that's to somewhat an environment I can kind of contain that help me to sort of reconnect with change and my cause and effect on things. I mean, just like as an example, like my compost bin is like a very direct connection I have with change, with sort of creating a complete closed loop cycle of my waste and seeing how I can regenerate something into new energy. And I'd like to think of that kind of idea of waste, even if it's like a wasted emotion or something that can become energy again once it's like given that chance to regenerate. So it's really quiet practices like that I personally find as a really helpful way to kind of feel that I do have some control and I can see some tangible impact. Because often things on the computer or online can be just very conceptual. So I find things like that can help me to reconnect and feel a bit more empowered in the situation.
Yeah, I think as activists, most of our focus is on that kind of system change lens and, you know, holding big corporations and governments to account. But sometimes it does feel quite satisfying knowing that you've done something yourself positive that day, like composting or saying no to a, you know, disposable coffee cup. Tiny little things, but sometimes they make you feel a bit, oh, I actually had a positive thing today that happened. And Paul, we've already kind of heard your advice on what you would give to other people to avoid burnout, but I'm really keen to hear what you do on a kind of more personal level yourself.
As someone who's been an activist most of my life, virtually all my close friends are activists, and so I find that I spend basically all the time I'm spending with people, spending with other activists, and and there are these really beautiful, loving people in the activist community. There are also some very toxic people in activist communities. So one thing that I started doing was just thinking about who I'm spending time with outside of my activism, and also in sort of my closest circle of friends. We kind of do these exercises about how long can we, like if we're hanging out some afternoon, how long can we hang out without talking about our activism? Can we just talk about gardening? Can we talk about, just something, just give our bodies and brains a break from that, knowing that we're actually strengthening our activism just by connecting with each other and growing our love and respect for one another. So I think, thinking about how I spend my time outside of my activism and with whom I spend it, and trying to spend it with not people who are like mindlessly positive, but just not people who are mindlessly negative and toxic.
Yeah, that wraps really nicely kind of back into what Days was saying about finding that joy and noticing and recognizing the nice, happy, joyful things that are happening around us. Thank you all so much for those answers and for your participation in the panel. It's been super interesting for me, so no doubt it's been super interesting for everyone that has been watching and listening as well. I hope those of you who are watching and listening have found it useful and have got some advice about how to deal with burnout, or that you can pass on to your communities. And thank you very much. Bye.